If you want to use dependency injection in your MVC applications, we need to look at how the MVC framework resolves dependencies. So let's assume, for example, that we've got a bunch of objects out there with constructors that rely on interfaces or abstract classes. They need their dependencies passed in from the outside. How is the MVC framework going to get at those objects? Well, the good news is that it's relatively easy to wire up a dependency injector to the MVC framework, because this is such a common thing that software developers do these days. The latest iteration of the MVC framework has made it relatively easy. Really, all you need is a class that implements getService and getServices. These are the methods that the MVC framework expects. GetService is used to return one concrete instance of an abstraction. GetServices is used to return a collection of implementations of the same abstraction. So for example, if you had iLogger and you only had one implementation of that, say SQL Server Logger, then GetService would be what you'd use. There's only one possible implementation. But if you had a SQL Server Logger and an event log logger and a text file logger, there could be multiple implementations of iLogger, and getServices would be the method that the framework would need to use. So as long as you have a class that will implement both of these methods, then you're good. You've got dependency injection working. You just have to tell it what happens when it asks for a service or services. Whatever you're using to implement these methods then gets wired up in global.asax. That's not the only place you can wire it up, but it's a very common place to wire it up. Ultimately, it's something that needs to be registered with the application, and global.asax is a common place to do that. You can even write your own. I don't recommend this most of the time because, once again, dependency injection is a solved problem. People have already written frameworks. Some are very lightweight, some are very elaborate, depending on what your needs are. There's virtually no real need to write your own dependency injector. The only time that you might consider it is if your application is very small and for whatever reason you don't want to use a full-blown dependency injector. You just want to have like a dictionary of interfaces and implementations or something, or you're doing a service locator. Then you might write your own and wire it up to MVC the same way you would a dependency injection framework. But most of the time, using a dependency injection framework is going to get you where you want to go. What I've got here is an MVC project that is using StructureMap for its dependency injection framework. The reason that I chose to go this route is because not only is StructureMap my favorite, but it actually shows you all the different aspects of wiring up a dependency resolver to the MVC framework. And the cool thing is that it does it automatically. Now, StructureMap is not necessarily the best dependency injection framework. It just happens to be the one that I use in a lot of projects. There are plenty of other perfectly excellent choices depending on what your needs are. But I wanted to show you how this relates to the things that you will need to do if you don't use a pre-constructed dependency injection framework. I want to show you the way StructureMap has dealt with these issues. So one of the things that needs to happen is you have to implement the getService and getServices methods. And this has actually happened here. StructureMap actually throws in a few different classes so that it can separate out some of the different aspects of its functionality, which I actually appreciate. But for our purposes, what you want to take a look at is the StructureMap dependency scope. And down here, for instance, here we've got this method getServices. So when the MVC framework needs to get a implementation, it's going to give you a type. Okay. So this type is going to be like iLogger, or I this or I that, or maybe an abstract class. So what you have to do when you override this, and this comes from service locator implementation base, okay, so that's important. This is the base class that has these methods. So what you're going to need to do is say, okay, when I get this I whatever, how am I going to give it back a concrete implementation? Now, if you're just doing a very small application and you're writing your own service locator, instead of this, you might have a dictionary where you have the first entry being the type, I logger, and the value being the concrete implementation, new logger. And then you can return, whatever value happens to match up with that key. There's all kinds of different things you can do here. For structure map, it's using its own container. So it's just delegating this to its own containers, get all instances, okay, and then casting that to whatever the type was that got passed in. You can see here we've got the do get all instances, which overrides the base class's do get all instances, and we've got the do get instance, which overrides the base class get instance. So here's an example of where you get a service type and a key, and here they go through the logic of returning the service type. So you may not understand all this code, and that's fine. You don't need to understand it. I just want to show you that when you do dependency injection with MVC, it's expecting these getInstance and getInstances methods. Structure map implements them this way. If you're writing your own, then you will have to implement these and implement them another way. Once again, I don't really feel there's a strong need to do that for most applications. Even for smaller applications, I'll still just use structure map or some other DI framework. But that just shows you the kind of code that you're going to need if you decide to hand roll your own. The other thing I want to point out is we've got this class, and we've got this class that implements the getService and getServices methods, but we need to wire it up to the framework. Now, 99.999% of the time you're going to do that in global.asax, and under application start you see all these different config register, config register, config register, config register. You're going to have your own config register, and in fact that's exactly what structure map has done. The only thing is, instead of sticking it in the global.asax, they've actually used web activator to do the same thing. So instead of using global.asax, they've gone this route, but it's the same principle. And what they've done is they've wired themselves up this way. The iContainer equals IOC initialized. Notice this iContainer is a structure map class. But here's where the MVC specific stuff kicks in. All you have to do is set the dependency resolver, set resolver, to whatever it is that you want to handle dependency injection. So they did it here, and they did it in the global configuration dependency resolver. So these two guys right here, if you decide that you're going to write your own DI injector or your own resolver, then this is what you're going to need to do, is in the global.asax, or I guess you can use these attributes too if you want, but you're going to need to set these things. Now, this may look weird and arcane, but if you only knew what came before this and the kind of hoops that you had to jump through to wire up a dependency injector to an MVC project, there was a lot you had to do. Here, as long as you've got something, a class that implements those methods, you can do it in 2 lines. Okay, and that's great. Now, here's the kicker. And here's why I advise people to go ahead and use a pre-existing framework rather than writing their own, unless they just really need to. All I did to get all this is I just went here and I right-clicked on Manage NuGet Packages. I searched for Structure Map, and I hit Install, and I installed the MVC4 extensions. When I did that, it went ahead and created those classes. It did the wiring up. It did the global.asax work. It did everything I needed to do, and it's already registered. Everything's good to go. I don't have to do anything else. The dependency injection is now going to work automatically. I don't have to do anything else with it. So that was super easy, much easier than writing my own and wiring it up by hand. So I've shown you the code that you are going to need to use if you want to write your own, and you can sort of see the guts of how dependency resolution works in MVC. It's relatively simple compared to what's gone before, but you will save yourself a lot of time and hassle just by taking a dependency injection framework that's already been written and using it.